All right, welcome to the AltAc Rockstar webinar today. I'm very excited to welcome Dr. David Pitts for our conversation. As I mentioned, I am standing in for Shannon Magnuson, who normally leads these great conversations, but I'm really excited to be and honored to be part of this conversation today. So a quick bio before we get into the conversation with Dr. Pitts. First is David Pitts is a senior research fellow in the Justice Policy Center and director of the Prison Research and Innovation Initiative at Urban Institute. This is a multi-year project leveraging research to promote transparency, innovation, and well-being in U.S. prisons. Dr. Pitts uses evidence-based strategies to promote prison reform that benefits both incarcerated people and correctional staff. And toward that end, he has partnered with an array of advocacy organizations, nonprofit service providers, and departments of corrections. His work has addressed a variety of topics in this area, including restrictive housing, prison education, visitation, and correctional staff well-being. In addition to his criminal legal system research, he has written extensively on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in public policy. He has consulted for government organizations at all levels, from small cities to federal agencies, and has taught a variety of courses to graduate students in public policy and criminal justice programs. He is currently an adjunct professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York, and he spent a decade in academia as tenure track and tenure professor prior to his work in applied criminal legal research. So brilliant bio, and many thanks to David Pitts for joining us today in this conversation. And in the spirit as if Shannon were here asking the questions, I'm going to begin with one that is very interesting, I know, both to her and myself. But first is asking you, David, about your specialization in corrections and applied work. We'd love to know a little bit more about what led you to this particular arm of criminal justice research.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming and for having me today, and happy to answer questions you have along the way, and also to connect with you afterwards. So I will put my email in the chat before I'm done if you don't have it otherwise, so that you can get in touch with me, and happy to have one-on-one meetings if that's helpful in the future. So I'm in an interesting sort of spot in how I came to the work that I do. But I guess the one thing I'll mention is that, as many of you know, a lot of people who do work in the criminal justice policy area, very broadly construed, are there because they have some sort of personal involvement in the system. So I know I've worked with a lot of former police officers, a lot of former correctional officers who have come to research or to policy work from previous experience. In my case, I was incarcerated for about a year. And so I came to this from that perspective, as somebody who lived in facilities and encountered a system that I found at multiple points didn't seem to work particularly well. And so I thought that moving out of that experience, it would make sense for me to think about ways to improve the system. And I, at the time, had a PhD in public policy. I had been in academia for about 10 years prior to my own incarceration. And so I had a skill set that lent itself to thinking about improving a system that, again, I think most of us would agree doesn't always work as it should, and decided then to think systematically about how research could help prisons, jails, and other carceral facilities better structure what they do to meet the needs of those who are incarcerated within them, but also those who work there. One of the things that I saw in my own experience was not just that the experiences of incarcerated people could be improved, but also that the staff were working in pretty untenable conditions. And so the work that I've done since my incarceration has been toward those ends, and that's where I am now. I do what I call applied work because I think, for me, my motivation is less to contribute to a body of theory or to a literature, but more to contribute to on-the-ground problem solving and to improve practice as quickly as I can. And so most of the stuff that I do is really less theory testing and more immediate program evaluation, policy evaluation, and then technical assistance to people working in facilities to help them improve their operations, I would say.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that backdrop. And I think of special interest to our AltAc group, especially students who will soon be moving from their master's or PhDs, is understanding a little bit more about your own transition from your doctoral work into kind of academia and then the public policy sphere. So when you were at UC Irvine, you were working closely with Susan Turner, who also had previously worked at RAND. And so there seemed to be a synergy already between academia and these AltAc spaces. Can you describe a little bit about that mentoring relationship and what that looked like for you?
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to back up a teeny bit from that before I answer
Sure.
it, if it's okay. So initially, my PhD was in public policy from the University of Georgia, and I went into a very traditional tenure track position after having written a very traditional dissertation and coming out of a program that focused explicitly on academic placement as the only way. So I lived that whole sort of environment and culture for a long time. And when I came out of my incarceration, I was not going to go back to academia. I couldn't. It just wasn't possible, even if I had wanted to. And so I did, though, need to learn about what research in the criminology, criminal justice area looked like. And so I enrolled at UC Irvine in an effort to do that, and wound up doing 2 doctoral fields that are the requirement in that program, one in law and society, one in criminology. And during that time, worked with Susan Turner, who's my advisor and who helped me to get into some applied work via the center that she runs, or still runs there, the Center for Evidence-Based Corrections. Susan's transitioning into retirement now, but and talking with her, though, before I joined the program and when I went into the program and then as my advisor, really the entire time our plan was that I was going to go to a place like RAND or Urban or Vera or RTI. And so everything I did was in service of that. And at Irvine, it's a pretty large program. They like for people to go into academia because it improves their reputation, but they're open to people doing other things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that there were panels from time to time on non-academic careers that they had there. And so I would talk to folks there. But really, I think with Susan, she connected me to what applied work in a soft money environment looked like. And I can answer questions about that more as we sort of progress through the hour. But project work at a place like RAND or Urban or RTI or Vera, where it's a soft money environment and you're doing things on behalf of clients, it's structured differently, and you have to have a different, I think, sort of mindset about how you get your work done on a daily basis, kind of how quickly you respond to emails, how quickly you respond to contacts, how you think about your research and how your research can address the project needs. And so again, we can get into all of that later, but it was very targeted mentoring from day one from Susan. And that was incredibly helpful to me in getting through what I needed to do.
Yeah. Thank you for queuing up some of those later questions. Okay, then pivoting toward your current position as a senior research fellow and the director of prison research and the innovation initiative at Urban Institute. How do you define Urban within the AltAc industry space? Think tank, nonprofit, how do you classify that organization?
Yeah, well, so we're technically nonprofit, like most of the organizations in the space. I think very few of us are for profit. We're not supposed to call ourselves a think tank, but that's essentially what we are. Like, it's a think tank. We do applied research, and at Urban, we have a variety of different areas. So it's not just justice policy. We have like health policy, tax policy, a variety of different social policy sorts of things that are within it. And so it's pretty large scale social policy organization by comparison to to a place like Vera, which is all criminal justice research. But then Urban is also a little smaller than RAND, which is enormous and includes a lot of defense contracting sorts of things and other areas of research that I wouldn't necessarily call policy at all, but rather just very client-driven work. And so at Urban, we have a lot of researchers. We're almost all in some area of social policy, and we're all working generally on soft money and contracts.
Okay. And so one of the things that's also part of that endeavor is technical assistance. And so one of the things you've mentioned in previous conversations is around the role of technical assistance. So can you describe for the folks in the room about kind of what is technical assistance, and then what are some of those activities that you do related to that?
Yeah, so I think I do two different sets of things at Urban. One is research, where I'm this third party researcher. I'm brought in to evaluate something someone else is doing, and the idea is I keep a distance there so that I can provide quote unquote objective evaluation of what's going on within the agency or the policy or the program. And that's my research function. But technical assistance differs from that pretty significantly in that rather than being this third party person over here, I'm really working closely with the agency to think about ways that it can offer a program, restructure a program, um, adhere to a new policy or a new mandate, and really think about how the agency's practice can change in order to be more effective. And so that might mean working with them by collecting data and doing a little bit of research about what they have going at the moment in order to get them where they need to be. So there may be research built into it, but it's really just troubleshooting with them and helping them understand how they can better do what it is that they're already doing, or how they can add programming to what they already do. And some of that sort of instruction, some of it's training, it really is so tailored to the needs of the agency or to the client that it varies pretty significantly in order to get their practice or their current programming where they'd like it to be.
So thank you for that description, because that's not always something that people are involved in during their doctoral work. Is that something that you were doing at UCI on the projects you worked on there?
A bit, but not a whole lot. And I think the thing is with the technical assistance is that, as many of you know, if you've worked with agencies in the criminal justice space, whether it's like a police department or corrections agency or even a local advocacy organization, you have to establish credibility with them in order to be taken seriously and in order to get your work done. And there are various ways of establishing that credibility. And when you're doing research, you sort of have a built-in credibility because you've been to graduate school, you've learned all these methods, and they're going to respect the fact that you have these tools that you know how to use that they don't understand, but they appreciate as being technically what you should be doing to complete an evaluation or to be a competent researcher. But when you go in and you're trying to help them improve operations, there's a sort of insight they're going to expect of you that's going to have to come from some sort of experience. And so if that's something that interests folks to do, I think getting some experience on the ground with these agencies in some way, and it may be as a researcher at first, but you've got to have some, I think, interaction with them so that you can speak their language, you understand their day-to-day challenges, and you can present to them a credibility that you bring that not only is based on your education, but also something about your experience. And that can be, again, as little as interacting with other agencies like them as a researcher, but you need to have done some of that interaction and have some of that experience, I think, in place before technical assistance is going to be something that they're going to want you to do. And even at Urban, I think, we generally will introduce people to TA, technical assistance projects, under someone else first. They get a chance to see what the organization is like. They build that credibility, and then they're able to lead it on their own.
Mm-hmm. And so as I'm thinking about this, did you have these skills prior to going to UCI? Was this something you did in your public policy work?
A bit, yeah.
Okay.
I did a bit of applied research and technical assistance with organizations that were looking to improve different management practices. That back in my earlier days, I did a lot of DEI and management consulting work and technical assistance work. And so I had that skill set built up a bit. But when I came into the criminal justice policy space, I had not worked with a ton of agencies. All I had by way of experience was my incarceration. Mm-hmm. I thought that was going to work against me, frankly, because I thought, these organizations that I had seen not always having a very positive, attitude toward those that were incarcerated within them, I thought they would perhaps not value that as experience. But what I found, interestingly, is that particularly in corrections, a lot of people have told me that they almost would prefer to work with someone who had been incarcerated over someone off the street who'd never been inside a facility, because at least I understand what that looks like. I know what that environment is, and I understand the challenges that everyone faces within it, not just those who are incarcerated, but those who work there. But right now, corrections, it's a tough spot because a lot of people who are prison abolitionists have strong anti-prison views. They feel very strongly that people who work for prisons are not doing a socially appropriate thing. And so those in the corrections community often are a little bit shy about interacting with folks from the public that they don't know very well, because they're worried about, their preconceived notions of what that work looks like. And so for me, it's a skill set that I sort of have developed in bits and pieces, but largely at UCI began to sort of work through so I would get the credibility that I would need once I came out. And then when I got to Vera, which was my first job after being at UCI, at Vera, I was able to fine tune those skills even more.
Yeah. So you've talked about really this rapport building process with practitioners, with the people that you would provide this technical assistance to or with, and crossing a lot of lines of credibility. And I'm very interested to hear a little bit more about how when you enter into a new technical assistance relationship or you're meeting people for the first time, what is that establishing of credibility look like?
Yeah. That's tough because it's so different depending on who you're talking to. And I think for me, in any sort of technical assistance or actually any client relationship or partner relationship, Urban's trying to get us to stop saying client, even though often they're paying for what we're doing. So they really are a client, but let's just say partner organization. Anytime I think I work with a partner organization, I try to find points of commonality with the other people in the organization and things that we share by way of experience. And sometimes that means talking through where I went to school, sometimes talking through where I was in prison, sometimes where I'm from geographically, what sports I follow, what sports teams I like, what I know about their area and geographical area and what it's like to live there. And so really it can range from like some personal things that are not explicitly about work to some very work focused things that are not at all personal. And I think it's just making sure they understand that I'm there to help them. I like them in at least some ways, and I can build a rapport from there.
Okay. I feel like what I heard you just describe are the soft skills that perhaps academic training doesn't always prepare us for, but I think you've really captured it in such a beautiful way to describe how your own identity, positionality, and then just your skills, your rapport building skills bring you into a space. So one of the things that we're also interested in as part of kind of this endeavor to look at at alternative academic spaces is around policy work. So how would you describe what policy work looks like with Urban?
Yeah, I think it varies pretty significantly across different substantive areas within criminal justice. So we do a lot of policy work in helping prosecutors think about ways that they can, for example, reduce or reform sentencing, to change their practices to be more lenient on sentencing, to lower sentencing. We work with folks to think about how they might institute bail reform. We work with systems to think about ways that they can, for example, release people sooner in some cases, change parole and probation practices. And so when it comes to policy, there are two things that we do. One is working with organizations, as I just mentioned, to think about how they have leeway within their mandate to shape what they do, right? So change within the law. If the law lets them do these things, where within this range of options should they be, and how can they move policy to fit better with some goals that maybe they and we jointly develop together? And so that's part of what we do at Urban, and that is, again, usually around prosecution, sentencing, sometimes around release mechanisms for departments of corrections, sometimes with probation and parole. There's also the policy that's set by the legislature, and that's really political work. And we are a 501c3, so we can't lobby, but what we can do is educate legislators about what their different options are and how they might change policies to better address the needs that they understand they have in their population. And so we do a little bit of that, but being a soft money place, most of the policy work that is funded to be in partnership with agencies and organizations on the ground. So it's less legislative work and more the work over here. And so it's a lot of convincing organizations and people that they should change their policies and convincing them that they should change them in X, Y, and Z ways, because we know from research in our own work that maybe those ways improve the outcomes that they're looking to improve. So it's a lot of partnership, again, with actors on the ground, less so with the legislature, but sometimes it just depends.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for that that description, especially the kind of two-pronged situation between the technical assistant organizational side, the political side. And it really speaks to, I think, this, I don't want to call it a deficit, but this thing missing perhaps in some of our training around thinking about policy in that way. We tend to think about it as evidence, and then that's where the evidence stops, and we let other people take it from there. How would you advise students who are interested in this to develop their knowledge and skill set around policy in kind of this way?
Yeah, I think one thing I'm seeing in the funding environment, and so we think a lot at Urban about like, how is the funding environment shifting? And funding environment has historically been a lot of government funding, federal grants, federal contracts, but increasingly there's philanthropic funding from these billionaires that are giving away their money. They have an interest in criminal justice and have ideas about what that money could be used for. And in this money over here, there's a lot of emphasis on policy impact. They want things to change, and that is like a key driver of what they're doing. So I think the days of our being able to say, here's the evidence, go forth and do well with it, are gone. Like, that's not feasible anymore. That's great in academia, and that's absolutely what academia is in part for, is to create a body of knowledge that then others can use to make the world a better place. And that makes complete sense, and that's fantastic. But I think the AltAc spaces are going to be increasingly toward policy impact and toward being able to get things done on the ground, which means that as you think about how you train up for those things, I think you really have to not just stop at the research, but think about whether the research is useful, think about for whom the research is useful, and to think about how you can take research from context A and apply it to contexts B, C, D, and E. So maybe those are things that you think about already. What's the external sort of validity of what you're doing? Is this generalizable to these other places? How would you advise someone on the ground in this city over here to use the evidence that you've created based on this city over here? And so I think just being as, I think you should think about how you can visualize your work affecting how others do their jobs, and thinking about how you could maybe facilitate those connections. And that's a super vague thing to say, but at a general level, at this level, that's, I think, what I would say about it. And then the specifics are going to vary depending on what kind of area of criminal justice policy you're in. And I'm happy to answer questions about specific areas and what you think would make sense in your area of work, for example.
Yeah, so chime in, everybody, if you're thinking of something relative to the work that you're currently doing. I know one specific thing that came up for me when you just described kind of who your work is for, how is it impacting, what would that look like? It makes me think of kind of our products as researchers. So in the peer-reviewed manuscript hails supreme, but it really seems more it seems clearer to me that things like that are more translational in nature, whatever that looks like, is going to be where that research policy bridge is connected. So could you describe what some of those translational types of deliverables might look like, especially for urban or just in your own personal space?
Yeah, that's a great question. Journal articles are great, but for practitioners, they're not always ideal because they're behind paywalls a lot of the time, and they're long and they're technical, which is how they should be. They should be those things. Maybe not should be behind the paywall. They should be technical and so on. But so at Urban, we have different modes of dissemination, right? We create a dissemination plan for most of our projects where we're explicitly deciding ahead of time what we're going to put out and how we're going to do that in terms of the findings from our project and what we've learned. And so we often have a project report, a brief, a blog, or a combination of those things.
Mhm.
So blogs, it's the urban wire is what it's called. It's essentially just short briefs that live on the website where we're identifying some key issues from what we're finding and putting it out in 1,000 words or less. So these are really accessible to a variety of people. They're written in a way that the public can understand them, even if you're not in the criminal legal space. And it's got hyperlinks. Generally, a blog has hyperlinks generally built within it so that you can learn more about different topics that are raised in the blog that maybe we don't have time to go through in detail. Then there's the brief, which is generally, it could be a research brief or a policy brief, but it's short-ish, like maybe 3 to 5 pages of a PDF, hits the high points, not overly technical, might have a box with the methodology in it if we feel that we need to describe the methodology in detail. And then we have a project report option, which is longer, could be like 30 pages or more, that's going to really go into the level of detail that you would get similar to a journal article. The difference being that usually we're not very theoretically driven in what we're doing. So we're not going to quote unquote test a theory. We're probably not going to write hypotheses. We're not going to even write necessarily explicit research questions, but we will talk about sort of previous empirical work in the area if it's relevant. And we'll talk about what we found in our work, maybe, and how that contributes to or differs from the existing body of work. And then talk about practical and policy implications at the end. I think what I found with the practitioners that we work with is, as you can guess, they don't have time to read very long products. So our research reports, we don't tend to do unless the funder wants one. Usually we focus more on the briefs and the blogs. Sometimes we'll do webinars because we found practitioners love a webinar. They can get on for an hour and listen to what folks have to say. And then we try to make time to attend conferences that are attended by practitioners and present our work there. So the American Correctional Association, the Correctional Leadership or Correctional Leaders Association, American Jail Association, places like that. It's not in writing, but to be able to get have conversations with folks in those spaces, we found to be really helpful too.
Which circles back to the idea of building rapport with folks doing this work on the ground and developing those relationships in other spaces that aren't, the prescribed client or partner, rather, partner urban relationship. One other follow-up question about the kind of deliverables you described is, so for folks who are finishing their PhDs, what mechanisms might you suggest or think about or help think about for folks to turn that dissertation work into some of these types of deliverables, and where might those things land?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I think there are some, there are some practitioner-focused publications that are trade publications or publications associated with the primary professional associations that are good options for you to place your work. And so there are, I guess, two parts to the question. One is sort of like, where would you put the work that you've created in your dissertation in a way that others can access it and make sense of it? And I think looking at what the ACA, the AJA, Sheriff's Association, the Probation Parole Association, organizations that are membership associations of practitioners almost always have a journal of some sort or a newsletter, and that's a great place to start. You can actually get practice toward that by writing something up for the criminologist, right? The ASC newsletter that sort of forces people to, melt down what they've done into a more digestible length and into a way that a broad audience can understand it. That's something that's a skill set that I think is good to have. And so in terms of like where you would put your stuff, I think that's where you would put it. I think, though, when you think about how you can turn your dissertation into something that practitioners or others on the ground would want to read, you can think about just how you talk about your work to your parents or to your friends or to others that maybe aren't in your program, but who are thoughtful people out in the world who just want to understand what you're doing, and think about ways that you can maybe pull back some of the technical parts that aren't super important, but keep the ones in that are, and keep the ones in that people can generally grasp. And hitting that mark, hitting that sort of sweet spot of keeping true to what you've done, and not overly diluting it, but keeping it at a place where the general public can have interest in it, like that's hard to do. And that takes time to develop. And so I wouldn't be too anxious about getting that perfect from the get-go, because I think you're going to learn over time. At least I have. I've learned over time, like what it is that people seem to be able to digest, and what people can do who don't have your statistical training, your qualitative methods training, or your theoretical training. I think just thinking about ways to make it accessible to the public is an ongoing practice and an ongoing effort that you'll need to be engaged in if this is the kind of work that you'd like to do.
I appreciate the commentary about practice. I know that's something that I continue to work on, and it's really hard when you've been ingrained and have had this training that teaches you to write in one particular way. And on the face of it, you're like, oh, I just like cut the word count and it turns into a translational publication. Absolutely not even close. And so I love that advice about practicing those kinds of things and starting maybe from a totally different vantage point to begin distilling your technical, important theoretical research findings into things that people can use. So that is super valuable. And I have a feeling we're going to come back to that. But before we pivot to talking about kind of what working at Urban is like, I want to focus just a bit briefly on something you've touched on a couple of times, which is about this rapport building with partners and with partners and with practitioners, specifically bringing in your professional experience when you can. But one of the things that was highlighted in conversations before coming today was your emphasis on elevating the practitioner experience and elevating the voices that live in that space, the people who live and work in our correctional spaces. How have you come to bring that into the work that you do now, really like lifting up the voices of practitioners?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of project, but I'll talk a little bit about a research project, and we can go from there. So I think in research, there are a couple of ways that you can incorporate the voices and experiences of those most affected. And one is that you can make sure you collect data on those populations of people. You can survey them, you can do focus groups, interviews, whatever sort of your methodological strengths are, in order to get their voices into what you're doing. And they may be the entirety of the data you collect, or they may be just a part of the data you collect. But as long as it's there, I think that's useful, both in making sure you come to the right conclusions, but also in getting the buy-in of those around you or buy-in of those in the organization to appreciate what you've done and to value it. But in addition to that, there's another sort of suite of approaches that I think is gaining some popularity, and that's community engaged methods, participatory methods, where you are going to identify people within the organization and they're going to be partners of yours throughout the research endeavor. And so, for example, let's just say for a moment, I'm interested in correctional staff. When I start the project, I'm going to ask a group of corrections professionals within the organization to be advisors to me about the project. I will ask them their advice when I create interview questions or survey questions or other data collection mechanisms. I will ask for their help in collecting the data, ask for their help in analyzing the data, and ask for their help in interpreting what the data are telling me. And that keeps them involved throughout. It gets their input built in explicitly throughout. And it really, it makes for often, I think, a technically better product if managed properly. And there are lots of, it's a management heavy thing to using community engaged methods. But in the end, I think it helps, and it certainly gets you political, I think, points with the organization, because you've taken seriously what people have to say within it. And I think that they appreciate that from a researcher, especially because a lot of organizations, and you may all have experienced this, a lot of organizations in the criminal justice space have been burned by researchers before. Either the researchers came in, didn't really, acknowledge that they were in this organization where people work and live their lives, but rather extracted data from them, wrote it up in a way that maybe the organization didn't feel was true to what was happening, and then put it out into the world without consulting the folks who are actually doing the jobs and living the lives over here. And so I think we can be good citizens and good collaborators by trying to involve folks from the organizations in which we work however we can, community engaged methods being probably the most we would do that, but probably a good template for how we would get their buy-in in a way that, again, isn't extractive. And I think that's something that a lot of folks find problematic about what researchers do.
Mhm. Have you had those conversations with some of your advisors, the folks you asked to advise on research projects in organizations that you worked with?
The extractive thing.
Where they come to you and say, oh, before this is how this went,
Oh,
or
100%. No. And the thing is, like in the soft money world, so when we go to funders, we have to have a partner. We have to have a context to do the work. We're not just doing theoretical work. We've got to have like somebody that's doing something we want to evaluate. And so we have to talk people into joining us for this stuff all the time to keep our funding. And we'll talk to like a commissioner of a DOC or a sheriff, and they'll be like, no, we're not doing this. Look, we did this with X organization before, and this is what happened. And I'm absolutely not doing this again. It was too much work and we got nothing out of it. So yeah, this happens a good bit. And so this is why it's like, it's, you know, it's a repeat game. We've got to like keep playing it. We don't want to alienate people.
how do you, with your partners and the advisors that you get, how do you come up with the things that they believe will be most valuable to them at the end of the research project?
I think it's driven in part by what the funding opportunity might be. So for example, NIJ's released a whole bunch of solicitations in the past month or so for funding that they are going to have available. And in some of those solicitations in those RFPs, they have explicit things they want to get done and they want researched. And so when that's sort of what we're starting with, we'll go to the potential partner and say, look, here's this great grant opportunity. We have the opportunity to evaluate this specific thing. We know you are about to put into place a program that looks sort of like this. Would you be willing to allow us to work with you to evaluate that, write it up, and then get funding for it that then we can, you know, share to hopefully improve the program as it moves forward. And then they're working with us explicitly from the beginning to see how that plays out. When it's philanthropic funding, so when it's like a foundation that maybe has a little bit more of an open call for projects that's open to a variety of different approaches, in those cases, we may have a partner we've worked with in the past, and we'll go to them and say, look, we know that you've been doing these, you know, these certain types of programs in the past. We're curious if you might be interested in starting this thing we talked about 2 years ago, and then pitching it to the Gates Foundation to evaluate, because we really feel this fits with their portfolio and X, Y, and Z. And this could get us both some funding to, again, do some evaluation work that you would ultimately, hopefully find beneficial. And so it's really, I think, working with them from the very beginning, from whatever perspective we have, whether it's philanthropic funding or from the government funding or from some other funding, to identify what would really help them. Because if it's not going to be helpful to them, there's no reason for them to do it.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. Before we talk about a little bit about what it means to apply for, look for jobs, get a job at a place like Urban, does anyone have any questions for David about some of the things we've talked about so far? I saw in the chat that Andrea noted practitioner conferences, echoed that sentiment.
Honestly, and let me just double down on that too.
Yeah.
If you have an opportunity to go to a practitioner conference just as an attendee, they are incredibly helpful to hear basically them talking about what's important. Because, you know, in class and in school, you don't always hear like, you know, what practitioners care about, but there you will, and you will get a good sense of what they think is important. And I think that's helpful in framing your own work as being useful to them in a general sense. And to answer the question in the chat about specific ones, American Correctional Association, for me, because I'm in corrections, that one, American Jail Association, the APPA, the Probation and Parole Association, and I can't remember how that acronym works. Those are all good ones. I don't know about the policing ones. Those aren't my sort of forte, but I can find out. And if you have questions, email me and I can get you a list.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. And then certainly from within those to find regional organizations or within your own kind of jurisdiction that might be useful to go to. But I absolutely echo that sentiment of going to practitioner conferences is probably one of the most exciting things for me from a research standpoint, because you generate I call them the real ideas, the things that come from what is actually happening in places. And I've had the most success presenting at those conferences where I can dialogue with people about how these experiences map onto their own, how it could be useful for and generate a co-generation of ideas. They're very inspiring. So I absolutely agree. Okay, well, if you have any other questions, folks, put them in the chat, but we'd love to learn a little bit more about your perspective of entering into the AltAc space from kind of a hiring and day-to-day work life standpoint. And so the first question to start out this segment of the conversation is, what do successful people at Urban look like? What types of skills do they have, or experiences do they have when they come through the door?
Well, so at Urban, we hire people from at a variety of levels. So we have what we call a research assistant job, which is a permanent job. A full-time job. It's not like the part-time job that you would associate with being in school. And that's for someone right out of undergrad with no experience whatsoever. And then we hire all the way up to, of course, very senior people. And so what makes for a successful person at Urban obviously varies quite a bit among those different levels, but assuming that all of you are probably in grad school, is that fair? Okay, so
a mix of grad school and folks who are already in tenure track jobs, or people who are already in the AltAc space. So we have a mix.
Okay, well, so people who are at least a little farther along in their career, I think people who write well, that's super important. And if you don't necessarily love to write, that's okay, because a lot of the writing that we do is very short and targeted writing, and pretty concise. And also we have copy editors and a built-in infrastructure for that. So it shouldn't scare you, but we want people who come in who are able to communicate in writing and orally. And so you should be able to talk through your ideas reasonably well and reasonably coherently. And so if you have issues with that and issues with your writing, those are things I think you should probably practice. The people who are most successful, though, at Urban are one of two types. There's like an ideas person, and that person is someone who often has really creative ideas, can go to a funder and say, look, here's what I'm seeing in the field, and these are issues that we think we can remedy via X, Y, and Z things we'd like to try out. What are your interests in maybe helping us evaluate those things and work with agencies to put them into place? And the big ideas person is often a rainmaker for us, and we love that person, but that person rarely gets their stuff done in time. They're always behind and they procrastinate, and so they can't do everything. And so we have the second type of person who's like the workhorse, who is there on time, who gets their work done on time, who is on schedule, on target, super detail oriented, and very like detail oriented actually is the best way to put it. They're just always on top of what's going on. And so you could be one of those two types of people, and you would be fantastic at a place like Urban. You would just have different sorts of roles within the organization. I think most of us are somewhere in between those two extremes. We have elements of each, but I think that at the end of the day, clear communication is really important. I think flexibility is really important, and just knowing that, and willingness to engage with the world of practice. If you're not somebody that's comfortable talking to a sheriff or talking to a CO or a warden or a commissioner, it may not be the right place for you, because the thing is, even those of us that do a whole lot of sort of, back of the house research where we're doing data entry and data work, we have to go to site visits on site to work with the data folks that they have on site to understand how their data systems work and to get the data. And there's just a lot of interaction that takes place. It doesn't mean you have to be an extrovert, but it does mean you're going to have to be willing to go and do those things and interact with folks. And so you've got to have at least some openness, I think, to that to be successful.
You mentioned flexibility. What does that look like in practice?
It looks like a lot of different things. So it is rare that a project, and you all probably know this because you're designing dissertation projects and other things on your own, it's rare that those projects work like they're supposed to, right? Like nothing ever works like you pitch it, and there's always changes. And in the grants and the contracts we have, we're always having to modify budgets and modify project plans because the world shifts and we have to account for that. And, particularly with COVID, I mean, everything changed for all of our project work during that time, and we had to pivot, and that's just ongoing. And so being able to pivot and change course and essentially accept that your beautifully written initial plan is not going to work is key. And also in a place like urban, we do a lot of contract work, and sometimes, for example, I might lead this project over here. My colleague leads a project over here, but my colleague gets a job somewhere else and leaves. The project stays. And so I have to maybe take over that project and shift some things around to make that work. Or there's a deliverable that we have to do that is understaffed and it's due in a week. And maybe I have to chip in and write something up for part of it. So a lot of it is very, all hands on deck from time to time.
Yeah.
There might be a proposal we need somebody to help on. And we expect people to, not turn their day upside down to help out on something that's not important, but for something that is important, we might ask you to take an hour or two that you didn't know you were going to spend on this with relatively short notice in an effort to get things done. I will say we are good about keeping to a 40-hour week. We don't work beyond 40 hours. We're very careful about how we bill our time to projects. And so it almost prevents us from having to work more than that. Yeah. But within those 40 hours, it doesn't always look like you think it's going to look. And that's the flexibility, the key part, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a brilliant description. Thank you for walking through that piece. One of the things I took away from some of the other stuff you described was the essence of project management. Which might sound obvious to some people, but just thinking, I'm reflecting on my own transition from PhD to postdoc. I was like a complete shell shock of project management skills that I think I knew I had, but I'd not really practiced. So how does somebody depict those aspects on their resume, in their cover letter, in their, to demonstrate to hiring folks at places like Urban that they are able to do the work that you've just described?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me just say before I answer it, though, that even though that's the skill set you have to be successful at Urban, strangely, we do not always interview people with that in mind. And a lot of people we find develop that as they go at Urban. Yeah. So I don't want anyone to feel that because you've not done these things that it's not the place for you, because you can develop these things on the job. Ideally, you'll have a little bit of chance to do that now. And I think the way you depict that is by talking through some of the bigger projects that you've helped to manage. So if you've worked as an RA, or if you've worked with an applied research center at your university, or you've assisted a faculty member with a huge project, I think you talk through that in your cover letter, if possible. You note it on your CV if you can. And if you've been in a role that is essentially that of a project manager, and you're the PI on the project's okay with you terming it that, I think you say that explicitly on the CV that's what you've done. And I think the CV that you submit for a place like Urban doesn't need to look like the CV you would submit for an academic position. You can change some things around and highlight the project management. And that might be, again, making sure you term what you did properly as project manager. It may also mean bulleting out some things you've done along the project management lines. Those are some specific ways that you can get at it. And then, of course, in the interview, you'll be asked probably about how you've managed projects before. So having examples is always a good idea.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent advice. One of the points of conversation has been about this kind of translating the academic CV to the resume. And so aside from being very strategic in terms of in the terms that you use that are aligned with the job ad or the call, how would you suggest folks think about highlighting other skills? So I'm thinking about, okay, I have tons of skills in all these statistical or quantitative methods. Yeah. How does that translate to something like from a CV to a resume?
I think it's similar. I think you have like a skills and interests maybe section, and you can talk through what the skills are. And I would say statistical skills that you have, which is, I think a lot of people will list the classes that they've taken, which is not always the best match because like we don't know what these class
Yeah.
names and numbers mean. So understanding sort of how far statistically you've gone along the path to whatever. So understanding if you've gone past just basic multiple regression, if you've gone to like some of the tools that people use now, if you've done structural equation work, if you've done some HLM, if you've done factor analysis, which is structural equation, really, all of those little toolsy things that I would put sort of almost beyond regression as this next step up, you should just list those and list them by name. Absolutely, with software packages, you should do that. List all the software packages that you understand. So R, Stata, SAS, SPSS, all of those that you've done, you should list and put it definitely on the resume, just like you would on a CV. We look at those things for sure.
That's great advice. Okay, as we move toward the end of our conversation, one of the things that a myth that's been busted in a lot of places, AltAc spaces, is around this idea of intellectual freedom or autonomy, that AltAc spaces don't allow that. You have to do whatever the agency wants. But it's, from our understanding in your conversation, that Urban is a place that's not quite like that, that prioritizes research or independence. Could you describe that a little bit for the group?
Yeah. I think, we obviously we're soft money. So whatever work we do has to be funded, but there's a lot of flexibility in how we develop the work that's funded. And at Urban, we have internal funds in place to help people develop bodies of work, is how we call it. So even people at the entry level have access to a pot of money at Urban, and they can use that to develop connections with practitioners, develop connections with other researchers, just do some thinking time, and to identify the questions they'd like to ask and how they'd like to go about it. The idea being that they can develop concept notes that can then be taken to foundations for funding, or that can be modified into proposals that respond to RFPs that may be issued by government or others. And so we really want people to feel empowered to develop, again, bodies of work, or to develop ideas that they'd like to see move forward, knowing it's in this, again, funded environment where they're going to have to eventually get funding for it. But when we have written things that we put out at Urban, when I write something for Urban, I write it, and that is what it is. There's no sort of messaging control. There's no comms person that is telling me I am not allowed to say something. I can say whatever I want, and Urban will put it out if it meets certain quality criteria, meaning that it's thoughtfully done. I could basically argue anything from building millions more prisons to burning every prison down. And both of those sets of things would be fine from Urban's perspective. And kind of to that point, we had someone last year who was very interested in this idea of objectivity and whether it really exists, and wrote a thoughtful blog about, objectivity being somewhat of a myth. There's no such thing as objective evidence. It's all subjective based on our positionality and so on. And that was very much her idea. And she got really sort of bashed for it on Twitter and in social media because it was a position that a lot of people didn't necessarily appreciate. But Urban stood by her, and it was her, as a researcher, her choice to write it. And so we absolutely see your work as your work, and your work is something you should develop, and it should take on whatever tone and whatever position you have. So at least at Urban, that's a priority, and it's not always. So, that's something I think you should ask about if it's important to you, especially when you interview at places like Urban, to find out what the confines are.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I remember that blog, and I remember the Twitter sphere, and I was really inspired by the fact that Urban did stand back behind the author and the ideas. And I just think that speaks a lot for the kind of environment that Urban is around this idea of intellectual freedom. So it's really, really exciting to hear that Urban is that kind of space for people to work for. All right. So I know, Andrea put in the chat a question I want to make sure gets answered. That goes back to the conversation we were having about translating skills into the resume. And she's asking specifically about what software is prioritized in terms of usage at a place like Urban.
We don't prioritize one over the other. Most people come in with either Stata or R at this point, but and most of our projects use Stata or R. If you don't know either of those things and you know just, let's say, SPSS or SAS, you're probably going to have to develop some R or some STATA skills when you get to a place like urban, just because those seem to be the most common. But I think what we want to see is that you've had experience with a software package and you kind of understand what that is. Because I think once you've learned one of them, it's not always fun to learn another one, but like you kind of know what that looks like and you can navigate it without as much trouble.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Because I think, especially, imagining the move from your doctoral training into, your into career space, how you're thinking about the skills you've obtained and translating them is just feels like such a lift. And once we can get past that, we can get to the other space, the other pieces. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask David before we wrap up our conversation? So, David, being invited to chat with our AltAc group through DCS, through the American Society of Criminology, is there anything else that comes to mind for you that you'd want to share to these budding PhDs or people who are already working in this space that want to continue working in this space?
Yeah, no, I just put my email address in the chat, so please feel free to reach out to me one-on-one. Very happy to answer questions that you might have or meet with you as things develop. But no, just keep doing what you're doing, explore your options, and again, feel free to get in touch. I'm always happy to talk to folks. So thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing the email and the invitation to contact you. And thank you, everybody, for coming to sit on this webinar today. It'll be posted after all the other machinations behind the scene to get this thing prepared. But thank you again, David, for coming and chatting with our group. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Absolutely. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.